welcome to our inaugural public event for the new Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Research Collective at Elon University. My name is Lauren Gilmet. I use she, her pronouns. I am assistant professor of philosophy at Elon. And I'm delighted today to get to introduce and honor my colleague and mentor, Dr. Ann J. Cahill, and her wonderful co-author, Christine Hamel. But first, just a bit of context about this event and the initiative from which it arises. So, Elon's WGSS Research Collective facilitates an annual cohort of affiliated faculty and students who work together and/or in parallel on research projects in gender, race, and sexuality, completing 2-credit WGS 499s each semester towards sustained undergraduate research. By strengthening interdisciplinary research mentorship and generating intellectual spaces where feminist, queer, trans, and non-binary inquiry can flourish, we hope to create high impact and engaging intellectual experiences that will position our community to pursue competitive professional opportunities and value lifelong intellectual inquiry. Our 2021-2022 cohort of researchers, who are all here, will be presenting on Tuesday, March 22nd, Tuesday, April 12th, and did I do a thing? Thursday, April 28th, all at 5 p.m. in the amphitheater in front of Lindner. That's okay. And the rain location for that is Spence Pavilion 101. Applications to join the 2022-2023 cohort will be available soon in late April. And maybe I'm hitting a thing.
The light's flashing. Not you.
It's not me? Okay, cool. So for our inaugural year in this initiative at Elon, we are delighted to feature the work of Dr. Ann J. Cahill, a strong feminist voice on Elon's campus, and to select her new co-authored book with Christine Hamel, Bridging the Resources of Feminist Philosophy and Vocal Performance, for our inaugural common reading. We're grateful to the Office of the Provost for buying 15 copies of the book from Bloomsbury University Press to circulate to interested Elon colleagues and students, as well as our selected researchers. Toward organizing this event, we are also grateful for the support and funding of the Phi Beta Kappa Fund for Excellence and the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning. Finally, I want to thank the other members of the WGSS Research Collective Steering Committee, Kirsten Ringelberg, Liza Taylor, and Shana Mihas. Now to our speakers. So, Dr. Ann Cahill earned her PhD in philosophy from SUNY Stony Brook and joined the faculty of Elon in 1998. She is currently professor of philosophy and, well,
A long time.
it is a long time.
Yeah.
But you were very young when you got the job. I mean, you were frankly just out of 6th grade. It was really great. Surprising. But so she's currently professor of philosophy and director of national and international fellowships at Elon University. Cahill's research primarily engages feminist philosophy and philosophies of the body. Her earlier work includes 2 monographs in philosophy, as well as numerous articles. Cahill's first book, Rethinking Rape, 2001, was important in conversation with other feminist philosophers such as Susan Bryson for bringing ethical and political concerns surrounding sexual assault to the forefront of debates in feminist philosophy. I've been reading Dr. Cahill since that book came out when I was in undergrad. Her second book, Overcoming Objectification, A Carnal Ethics from 2011, argues for abandoning a notion of objectification because of its reliance on a Kantian ideal of personhood, which minimizes and even vilifies the body. Cahill argues that the problem with objectification is not primarily of rendering women as objects or non-persons, but of rendering feminine subjectivity and sexuality as derivative of masculine forms. Notable articles include Foucault, Rape and the Construction of the Feminine Body, Feminist Pleasure and Feminine Beautification, Unjust Sex versus Rape, and most recently, Bearing the Brunt of Structural Inequality, Ontological Labor in the Academy, which was a co-authored piece with Ruth Ann Crapo and Melissa Jackert. And related to this new book, Vocal Politics from 2020, and co-authored with Christine Hamel, Toward Intervocality, Linkletter, Body and Contemporary Feminist Theory. Her current research includes an intellectual history of Title IX. Christine Hamel is a performer, voice and text coach, director and writer based in Boston. As an assistant professor of voice and speech in Boston University School of Theater, she teaches various aspects of performance, including speech and dialects, singing and acting. She earned her MFA in theater education with a concentration in voice and speech from Boston University and a graduate diploma in voice from Boston Conservatory. Christine is a designated Linkletter voice teacher and holds a teaching certificate in the Michael Chekhov acting technique. I learned recently that we both completed our undergrads at Williams College and studied with some of the same professors. Christine's research engages the embodied voice and its social, political, and ethical aspects, interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches to accent, dialects, and speech, feminism, gender performance, and Shakespeare, and psychophysical approaches to acting and voice speech training and performance. And are you sure I'm not doing anything that's making that like that? Okay.
No, yeah, it's not.
Okay. I'm not doing it. I have to accept that it's not. That would be cool. Okay, so she explores the ways in which gendered and racialized voices are policed and measured by white supremacist norms, and how voice trainers can develop practices more sensitive to marginalized voices. Christine's work as a voice coach is furthermore extensive, having worked with the Actors Shakespeare Project, Court Theater, Huntington Theater Company, and many others. She also founded the Feminist Shakes Initiative at Boston University, which is committed to feminist and gender expansive retellings of Shakespeare. Please join me in welcoming the authors to speak about their new book, Sounding Bodies, Identity, Injustice, and the Voice.
No, okay, so let's use this. Okay. Oh, I start. Sorry, I start. Hi, everybody. I don't know if this is on. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're so excited to talk about this book that's been in the works for quite a while. I'm just going to give a quick roadmap of what we're going to do. We want to leave a lot of time for question and answer. But first, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how this project came about and what some of our central questions were. Then we're going to spend some time unpacking 4 conceptual frameworks that we developed through reading and thinking and talking together that really are sort of the backbone of the book. And then we're going to end with a quick excerpt from the book that shows a little bit about the kinds of analysis that you can do with some of these tools. We'll be really focusing on the first early chapters of the book, but for those of you who have read it, we can, of course, take questions about anything. So, how did this happen, Chris?
Well, Annie, it's amazing to me that we actually started to think about these questions like 7 years ago now. And I found that myself, as you know, I focused on training actors and actor voices. And so around 2015, there happened to be in the media, social media, sort of on voice teaching listservs in National Public Radio, all of this sort of heated conversation about certain vocal mannerisms that were sort of under fire. They were specifically vocal fry, the sound exemplified by like the Kardashians, particularly, and up talk, which rising vocal inflection. And so there was a lot of conversation going on, particularly amongst voice trainers, about honestly, about how annoying the sound was, but also how it was anathema to liberating oneself, owning one's power, and freeing one's voice. So as a Linkletter teacher, I'm called a freeing the natural voice teacher. And so I found myself getting irritated at the critique at the time, which sort of ran up against some ideas I had about like what I thought freedom was, or what it should look like, or what a liberated voice would be. And so I found myself trying to articulate that it seemed to me that this was another opportunity to sort of shame and correct. It was mostly women who were being criticized for this vocal trope. And I also thought, that perhaps the vocal fry in general just struck me as a more or less useful surface onto which to project our always present, but we usually can't express it, sort of fear and terror at the idea of having women in positions of authority or power or influence. And it also seemed to me that the idea of the big, strong, unfettered, free voice also felt to me sort of masculine coded, and that we needed to identify that as voice leaders. So I really had this ethical question. So how do I think about this in terms of training voices? And training voices for the stage is a very particular thing, but even in that context, I was called to do this work in a way because I'm deeply interested in the intense connection between the voice and the self, and the capacity for transformation, for resisting oppression through theater, through voice, empowerment, and I'm interested in the liberatory aspects of voice. But my question is, how can I liberate voices and not unwittingly do harm, not shame voices back into hiding? And am I unwittingly enacting unjust practices in the name of liberation by assuming certain things about different vocal mannerisms? So, Annie and I were friends first. We just know each other, and we through my spouse, and we were just talking once,
Yeah.
and I was like, look, I have kind of an ethical question,
Yeah.
and you're the right person to ask.
Yeah.
And then one thing
that's
led
right.
to another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of what Chris was telling me was about some of these figures in the voice and speech field. And she was saying, well, there's one that I work with a lot, and that approach is about freeing the natural voice. And so she explained it to me fairly quickly, and I had a very negative reaction. I said, oh no, 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 no. There is no natural voice because there's no natural body. There's nothing, under that. So I had this really negative reaction, which you said was predictable.
I think I was asking you because I knew you had it.
Yeah. So after that conversation, I went back and I started thinking, I'm a feminist philosopher of the body. Well, we've been studying maternity for God knows how long. We've been studying mobility. We've been studying lots of embodied phenomena, but I hadn't read anything about the voice as voice. In my field, the voice was always a metaphor. Finding my voice, bringing more voices to the table. It's a really interesting metaphor, but it was always a metaphor. And I'm interested in actual embodied phenomena, like what our bodies are to us, what we can do with them, what they mean to us, and how they're implicated in systems of inequality and in resisting those systems of inequality. So I went back and I thought, there's this huge gap in the literature. So let's study it. So some of the parameters, right? First of all, we're interested in the soundedness of voice. We do bring in a few things of language every once in a while, but we're really interested in how sound is meaningful and how it's implicated in social and political systems of inequality. So it's the sound of human voice that we're interested in. We're not interested in the metaphors. We're interested in human sonorous relationships. And I'm going to pass this back to you. We're interested in the materiality of the voice.
Yeah, and I would say it was obvious to me that there was a gap before I move on to that, a gap in my field, which is that we really hone, we sort of hone our methodologies and pedagogy, but the sort of philosophical implications of what we do were largely unquestioned. We're not philosophers, although of course what we do has implications. But go back to this idea of the material aspect of the voice. We think of it as profoundly rooted in the materiality of the body, but worth saying multi-sensory, that voices are felt by the speaker and those who are receiving, heard, seen. It's really meaningful that we see and hear at the same time, because we create meaning out of all the sort of multi-sensory nature, the context, gesture, visual narrative, facial expression, accent, dialect, all play a really important role in how we receive voices. So the notion that of the reception of voice is a constitutive component of how voice, the event of voice happens. And we really do think of voice as something that is done. It's an event rather than a thing. Voice always happens in a context, in a material acoustic environment. It can't be heard exactly the same way by any two subjects, meaning it's profoundly subjective in that sense. And also all humans who listen to voice have habits that are profoundly marked by social norms and auditory practices and their own embodied experiences. So like an example of that would be if someone hears a loud sound and they've endured PTSD, they're going to receive that very same sound very differently than someone who doesn't. So we have to acknowledge that we take up the auditory information really differently. And then one other aspect of that is that when I hear my own and receive my own vocal sound in relationship with others, so my prosody, which is my rhythm, my intonation, my rate of speech, my tone, my volume, I'm always kind of shifting and marked by those with whom I'm in relationship. So we don't ever voice in a void, we don't voice in a vacuum. So I'm going to move on to our first. Do you want to say a little bit about the tenets, the basic theoretical principles, or?
I'll just say one, and then we'll get, because it'll lead right to intellectuality, which you're going to take on, which is that I'll say two. One, the body is very important to us. The materiality of voice is very important to us, but the body is not defined as a biological entity. So we don't reduce the body to sort of natural phenomena. You could guess that, right? We consider the body to be a deeply political and social entity. And we consider the human being to always be in relation to others by definition, not like you exist and then you join in relationships. No, you actually emerge out of relationships. So we push back against the notion of the self as autonomous, self-contained, and primarily individual. And that comes up, all of that comes up in our notion of intervocality.
Great. So I'll tell you more about that. So intervocality is sort of our fundamental principle, that it's the theory that voice always emanates from, takes place in the context of, and is sonorously marked by human relations. It's always only social. So this is a fundamental reframing of voice, particularly in the context of voice and speech training. We often see the voice as untouched, pre-social, primordial, raw material that's then impacted or shaped by culture or language or participation in social life. And this is it pervades all discussions about voice in my field. Like yesterday, I saw an Instagram post by a lovely Hollywood speech coach that I know, but her post was, your voice is the what, and your speech is the when, where, how, and why you use your voice. And we're saying something quite different, which is the when, where, and the why are all present in your voice. It doesn't live under context. It is constructed materially in a complex political social context. So in intervocality, the voice is a set of capacities and modes of embodiment arising from and taking place within multiple relations, social relations, environmental relations. Human voices, their timbres, resonances, prosodies, dynamics bear the sonic mark of how those voices have been heard and how they're heard in the present. And just as the details of bodily comportment are profoundly influenced by social context, so too the quality of an individual voice can vary in drastically different ways depending on its vocal purpose, the sonorous grammar of the situation, or the address. So for an example of that, or example of intervocality in this sense, is that, you know, if I'm listening to someone and I can't see them and I know that they're on the phone with someone that they're in relationship to, even if I don't know the text and I don't know the context, I might be able to tell what the relationship is through the quality or the tone in their voice, if it's their child, their spouse, their colleague, and that person is fundamentally marked by the person that they're speaking to. Thinkers in the fields of musicology and sound studies have emphasized this very thing, the intersubjective nature of sound, providing detailed descriptions of the shaping of sounds and social meanings of sonorous events by the material environment, practices of listening, racial and gender norms, and so on. We emphasize intervocality as an existential and ontological modality of voiced human persons. We're adding that facet of vocality to these models, that the voice's sound is marked by the surrounding receiving bodies. We voice with others, according to others. Voice is not created in a vacuum. And going back to the idea that voice has traditionally been conceptualized as existing prior to language, before speech, and understood as conditioned into it, we also just want to argue that the context of speech is always present in the voice. Even if the vocal utterance's destination is not necessarily speech, we always have the context of language. Like from in utero, the context of language is fundamental to creating voice. And so this is a big challenge to the notion that the voice is universal or natural, and that speech is cultural. The voice itself is marked by a linguistic and social environment that is bound by culture. Another thing about intervocality, voice is often identified with individual uniqueness, which is something that Anne is going to talk about in a moment. But in popular voice training methodologies, we do use the phrase a lot, the voice is you, used to acknowledge the relevance of voice for the self, that where we're not using the voice as a mechanical instrument separate from the self. But our focus on intervocality troubles an easy association with the voice and the individual self, or as Annie was saying, the self-contained subject. So we're not that interested in just my unique voice or the voice of the unique me. We do reject models that assume that identity is fixed or indelible or immovable, like a single self encrusted under layers of socialization prior to social and political structures. We assume that it's always under construction. Self is embedded and enmeshed in dynamic social relationships, that identity is embraced, vocal identity is part of our intersubjective becoming or intervocal becoming. And sometimes our sense of self is clearly defined, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it changes over time or fragmented or even inaccessible. So the idea that the voice is you is probably an oversimplistic notion. You don't need to have a voice in order to be a human subject, but we do argue that the voice is a really deep feature of the self and an important aspect of one's identity locations and self-perception.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about vocal injustice. So if we're right about the voice, that we not so much have an individual voice, but we are intervocal beings, and our vocality and our vocal capabilities comes out of relations, then we immediately have the echo question, right? Because where there's relations, there's always the possibility for flourishing and the possibility for domination and inequality and such. So how are we to understand vocal injustice in particular? Well, one way we can understand vocal injustice is pretty empirically, and we, in the book, use some empirical data to show, for example, how dominant soundscapes are, no surprise, dominated by voices that are recognizably white, male, and cis, usually, right? So, and if you look at the numbers for movies, Disney movies, even when the lead is female identified, she still doesn't get the most airtime. In fact, she doesn't get half often. So we can sort of count like how the vocal social good, which is a term that we use, of airtime is disproportionately represented along some pretty familiar lines. We can also look into the politics of interruptibility, right? Who gets interrupted, when, and how. And even, this is really interesting, which interruptions register as interruptions. So when female identified people are interrupted, sometimes that doesn't even register as an interruption. It's like a, thank God someone stepped in kind of situation, you know what I'm saying? So, but if women interrupt, those are seen as a much more aggressive interruption, and we tend to overestimate the amount of airtime that female identified people use when they interrupt. So there's all this empirical data. The stuff on the Supreme Court, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg got interrupted more than her male identified colleagues. Like even if you're freaking Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? People still think that what they have to say is more important than what you're in the middle of saying. So it's some pretty amazing stuff. So there's that empirical side where we can say in contemporary Western society, our ears are trained to expect dominant voices as both ideal and the norm, okay? And the other voices are more marked. But that's not the only way to understand vocal injustice. And we talk about three very different approaches to vocal injustice, all of which we disagree with. I mean, we agree with some parts of them, but then we disagree with some parts of them. So the first one is Kristen Linkletter, who we've already mentioned, a towering figure in Chris's field and someone with whom Chris studied. And she's the one who wrote this very influential book in the 1970s, Freeing the Natural Voice. That's what it was called, had a very influential second edition, taught in theater programs, but also beyond. I mean, a really influential book. Linkletter's approach says that, as Chris has already implied, right, or it's already stated, that society has cramped the natural voice. So you're sort of born with this natural range that's really big and really large, and socialization comes along and stifles it, stunts it, along gender lines certainly, but also just in general. And that the voice work is to remove all of that socialization to let that voice that was under there all the time come out. Okay, so you probably already can predict how we disagree with that, so I'm just going to move on. Philosopher Adriana Cavarero has a different take on vocal injustice. Hers is a kind of historical argument. She argues that the discipline of philosophy was once a vocalized discipline, right? Where the use of the voice was central. You read books aloud, you talked with other people. I mean, Socrates didn't even think you should write anything down, right? That to do philosophy was to engage in a vocal exchange. And because she's really interested in the way the voice can be recognized, its uniqueness, that individuals can be really with high levels of accuracy, can be identified by their voice. So like if one of my sisters came up behind me right now, I've got a bunch of sisters, but if one of them came up behind me right now and started talking, I would know who that was, right? With a high degree of accuracy. So what Cavarero argues is that when philosophy and logos was devocalized, particularity was left behind. And we adopted a value of universality and neutrality, okay? And that what we need to do is bring the voice, and she means the material embodied voice. That's the voice that's unique. This is not a metaphor either. This is the one thing that we do agree with Cavarero about, right? That it's the material voice that's unique. Bring that back to philosophy, bring that back to politics, and we'll have actual exchanges across real differences. But what's important about the voice for Cavarero is uniqueness, which means, in her Arendtian view, we have to let go of social group membership. So the important thing about my voice is it sounds like me. It's not important that it might be marked by the fact that I grew up in Massachusetts, even though I don't have a lot of that accent. It's not important that I bear the mark of living in the South for almost a quarter century, right? That doesn't matter. What matters is I sound like me. So she said we have to go away from any group membership. And we're going to disagree with that too. We're going to argue that the way in which the voice is marked by group membership is meaningful and not necessarily problematic. And that's another thing I want to emphasize about intervocality. The fact that Chris could hear in my voice who I'm talking to on the phone is not a problem. So we really reject any ethics, any vocal ethics that centers on authenticity or realness. Okay, and the problem, the fact that my voice is marked by group membership is not necessarily a problem. In fact, that's one of the important things about vocal identities. Finally, we've got Nina Eidsheim. She's a musicology and sound studies scholar, and her first book is very much in line with our analysis about the intersubjectivity of sound, right? Her second book addresses the racialized politics of voice, and here's where we have some differences with Eidsheim. She argues that the voice has been taken to be a reliable indicator of various identity factors, with particular interest in the way that the voice has been taken as a vehicle of identifying racial identity. Okay, the fact that certain sounds may register as distinctly white. She's more interested in certain sounds, certain music, certain singing registers as distinctly Black. Okay. And she argues that in being taken as this kind of vehicle, it has reified and essentialized those social identities. And she argues that the constitution of the racialized voice is not a product of the sound of that voice, but is entirely a product of listening practices. So a recognizably Black voice for Eidsheim only becomes recognizably Black in the context of listening practices developed in a white supremacist context. Now, if that's what injustice is, then you can see where Eidsheim ends up, which is we are supposed to de-racialize the voice. We are supposed to stop hearing race in the voice and just hear expertise, whatever, but not race. We disagree with that. We do not think that vocal racial identity can be reduced solely to systematic inequality. We don't think racialized identities are reducible solely to oppressive practices. We think they exceed them. We think they have other important elements that are not encompassable by oppression. And we think that distinctly Black vocalizations have been crucial in undermining and challenging white supremacists. So that neutrality isn't going to get us there. Okay? So we see flaws in all of these concepts of vocal injustice. We disagree with Linkletter because we reject the notion of a natural voice or a natural person that exists as a substrate to socialization. Instead, we argue that the various relations that human beings enter into necessarily build that person. We disagree with Cavarero because although she has a point about the uniqueness of voice, it also matters that one's voice bears the mark of one's community. We disagree with Eidsheim because we don't think that hearing race in voice is problematic. In fact, we think Black vocalizations have been meaningful and crucial tools in the dismantling of white supremacy. So our notion of vocal justice doesn't refer to the natural voice, doesn't value uniqueness above all other qualities, and doesn't problematize the sonorous marks of belonging to a social group. Instead, it asks, how is the intersubjective phenomenon of voice implicated in systemic inequalities of all sorts? How is it used? How's it being harnessed? And why, and how can we become more aware of it? Vocal injustice can take the form of vocal inequalities, the disproportionate distribution of vocal social goods. But it also takes the form of using the embodied phenomenon of voice to render certain individuals or groups inferior or marginalized. The problem is not that some voices sound old. The problem is that older voices are, at least sometimes, dismissible by virtue of their sound. We do not think that vocal justice should take the form of not hearing social identities and voices, but that it should take the form of not creating hierarchies on the basis of those sounds.
So going back to the idea of voice is not a noun, but more a verb for a moment. We're going to sort of introduce the idea of envoicing, and that the phrase "at the ethics of envoicing" as it relates to vocal justice. So we want to I just want to go back to the idea that we're acknowledging that voice exists in multiplicity and it's under construction in its sounding and its reception in an active ongoing process, absolutely within and resisting the existence of structural and systemic inequalities. And voicing is the social practice of bringing into being certain vocal identities, characteristics, habits, and can resist or perpetuate those injustices. So in keeping with our emphasis on the material aspects of voice as human-generated sound, we hold that an ethics of invoicing necessarily entails a sense of sort of a new principle we want to share with you, which is respiratory responsibility, which is an obligation to be accountable for the air that we and others breathe and the ways in which the movement of that air through bodies and inhabited spaces is imbued with social and political meaning.
And we should say we came up with that term before COVID.
It's true.
We feel like no one will believe us. But like the book was mostly done. It wasn't done, but it was mostly done. And okay. Yeah.
Respiratory responsibility highlights the phenomenon of breath and air as an essential building block of voice. So we use this term a lot in voice training, which is breath is sort of a blueprint for sound, a building block for sound. And that just acknowledging the fundament of that, air is a relational political substance carrying the effects of social practices, policies, and norms underneath it all, or within it all. So in respiratory responsibility, we argue that precisely because no one individual can fully control or determine the content of the air the body takes in, or the flow of the air in inhabited space, we all bear collective responsibility for each other's breath and therefore voices. So the voices that emerge within the context of intersecting human communities will bear the sonorous marks of the decisions, conscious or unconscious, that those communities, and more likely the powerful and prestige members of those communities, have made about both air and breath. So respiratory responsibility extends beyond responsibility for the content of breathed air to the responsibility for the social and economic situations that preclude or forward access to stress-free, easy breathing and access to voice, which then follows. Social and political practices and norms construct specific kinds of sounding and breathing bodies. Some examples: disproportionate levels of air pollutants, for example. It's other factors as well, but air pollutants resulting in high rates of asthma and asthma morbidity happens more among members of lower socioeconomic classes. It's injustice in terms of respiration. The dramatic increase of forest fires linked to severe heat and drought brought about by global climate change has a devastating effect on public respiratory health, including increased susceptibility to bronchitis or loss of lung function. Obviously, the effect of masking policies and the spread of COVID-19 has had a tremendous effect on breathing and on voices, especially for those who have been in crisis. COVID patients requiring respirators who literally cannot voice at all, let alone wanting to speak on end-of-life directives, and for those who experience the long-term breathing and vocal weakening effects of living with long COVID, symptoms of long COVID. So inequitable access to spaces associated with privilege in the context of white supremacy also have a role to play in inequitable access to the very freedom to breathe. So one very small scale example in a way is just in my own field. In terms of students having access to what's kind of a fundamental idea in voice training, in Linklater training in particular, a sigh of relief, underneath a sigh of relief. It's fundamental to our voice training, and the reason for that is that if I can sigh with relief, I have a blueprint for ease, for freedom, for a wide range of vocal possibilities as an actor, as a person, that are sustainable. I can play King Lear if I have a sigh of relief underneath. I won't feel that my voice will run out. You know, it's not overly taxing. It's really important. However, access to a sigh of relief, to free breath, is often taken up amongst voice trainers as kind of an equitable given. Like everyone should be able to have easy access to a sigh of relief, especially in the context of theater programs. So, you know, a sigh of relief has a lot of benefits. The release of tension through deep sighing can allow emotions to move through, can help work through some of the embodiments of trauma. But the assumption of easy and equitable access to such relief denies the fact that not all people are equally at home in predominantly white, affluent academic spaces or theaters. And even though it may not be safe or comfortable to deeply breathe or let alone make sound in those spaces without undue attention or the lingering embodied effects of feeling like an imposter. And then we can scale it in the other direction. So politics of breathing, rendering spaces in some lives as literally respiratorily risky. So the power relations at work, for instance, when a Black man in the United States is pulled over by a white police officer, charges the respiratory scene here with danger. So it's not at all surprising that the phrase Eric Garner repeated 11 times during his assault in 2015, "I can't breathe," became a prominent slogan for the Black Lives Matter movement. And the slogan reemerged, as we all know, even more strongly and urgently after police officer Eric Chauvin killed George Floyd by kneeling on his neck while Floyd pleaded for his life, saying, "I can't breathe," more than 20 times. This political refrain and Floyd's vocal repetition reminds us that breathability is not merely symbolic. It's not a metaphor, but a lived bodily enactment with life or death stakes.
So how might we think about creating vocal justice? How might we think about enacting and voicing and vocal interactions that are more in line with human flourishing? And we develop a notion called vocal generosity. This is grounded in Rosalind DeProse's notion of corporeal generosity, and then we take it into the vocal realm. So an important aspect of DeProse's notion of corporeal generosity is that she flips the chronology of gift giving. So most philosophy of gift giving sort of starts with, okay, you have a person already established and they decide whether to give something to another person. Rosalind DeProse says, no, that actually contradicts our ontology. By virtue of the fact that we are embodied beings, we are always indebted to prior corporeal gifts. The mere fact that we exist means that we have been the beneficiaries of corporeal generosity. And think of generosity not as a kind of like excessive altruism. It's a fact about the body. Okay, you just don't get there unless someone has given you gifts that are distinctly corporeal in nature. All right, so corporeal generosity is pre-person in a way for DeProse. Now, it continues. We continue to give each other corporeal gifts. So in North Carolina, in the agricultural sector, right, migrant community continues over and over to give the gift of food that the state is dependent on, both economically and physically, right? So what DeProse argues is that some corporeal gifts are memorialized and valued, some get statues, and some corporeal gifts are denied, ignored, and effaced. And that's where the injustice comes in. Which gifts are recognized, named, remembered, and which gifts are not only either not memorialized or forced. That's how DeProse understands any laws that limit reproductive justice. The state is forcing someone to give a corporeal gift. Okay, so what does vocal generosity then refer to? First of course, it returns back to our notion of intervocality. To be invoiced is to have been the recipient of corporeal gifts that are specifically vocal in nature. Again, this is one way in which we push back against the notion or conceptualization of the voice as primarily mine. Okay, there's always marked by the other. But it also speaks to the intersubjective capacity to invoice others. So by being intervocal, we have the capacity to invoice others in more or less harmful or just ways. Okay. And along those lines, it refers to something that we write a lot about. It refers to the constitutive act of receiving sound, in that the act of receiving sound is fundamental we argue, to the sonorous qualities of that sound and to its social and political meanings, right? So we must be attuned to that. So this is a way of saying we have to be attuned to our own responsibility for how we receive sound, right? Where DeProse asked which corporeal gifts are recognized and which are forced, we asked which voices are marked as inappropriate, unpleasant, too much, too little, better unheard. Now, in some ways, this sounds like a little bit of a familiar question, except you have to remember, we're not being metaphorical. We're not talking about voices at the table. We're talking voices actually in the room bouncing off the walls, right? Which ones, when they do enter, are met with disdain, disgust, correction, repulsion? So I don't know if you remember this, but I saw a concert in Greensboro. I told you about it, and they really bothered me. Like, I did not like them. They were from Brooklyn, and they were precious, and they were reedy. And I'm like, I did not like the sound of their voices. They sounded like white, annoying people from Brooklyn. So part of what we're saying, I'm still kind of annoyed by them, but part of what we're saying about vocal generosity is to tarry when we're having that negative reaction to the sound and resist the notion that, oh, my reaction is obviously just the natural, rational response that everyone would have if they were just thinking correctly, right? Now, that doesn't mean, a notion of vocal generosity does not mean that all vocalizations are welcome. Vocalizations can enact great harm, right? So vocal generosity does not mean everything and every vocalization should be welcomed. We are non-ideal theorists. We start from the presumption that we are embedded in structural inequalities and that justice involves rectifying or pushing back against that. Okay, so we talk a lot about tarrying with George Yancey, other philosophers who talk about this.
Do you want to say something about tone?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So a lot of what we talk about is how tone is used to marginalize people who are often in social categories that are marginalized or oppressed, and how members of marginalized and oppressed groups are often attacked because of tone, right? Don't mind what you're saying, but I just don't like the way you're saying it. I love it when people who have no expertise in activism or social change feel very comfortable lecturing activists that if they just had a nicer tone, it would work, which, by the way, has no empirical foundation whatsoever, right? So what we argue is that it actually makes sense that the tone is policeable, because focusing on the tone is a way of associating the speaker with the body. So it upholds the mind-body distinction, it upholds the nature-culture distinction, right? And it's something that really upholds a lot of structural inequality. So we're very suspicious now when anyone implies that it's the tone that's responsible for the message not getting through. Okay. So to aspire to greater vocal generosity, and here's where we're moving beyond to prose, is also to take steps and to practice creating more welcoming environments for marginalized vocalizations. And in creating those environments, we understand that as literally invoicing, literally allowing voices and sounds to emerge and to exist. Okay. Grounding our theory in an anti-oppressive approach allows us to recognize too how vocalizations deployed in the defense of unjust social structures are harmful and should be countered.
So we wanted to kind of take a turn here and offer just a little excerpt from the book about kind of understanding the implications of vocal sound in terms of commenting on and or sort of contextualizing political interests. So I didn't say that very well. Let me think about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Let me think about that.
So we're going to read a couple paragraphs from the book that show how social and political meetings are carried by sound rather than text. So Chris is going to read these two paragraphs that are about the latest staging of Oklahoma. If any of you have seen Oklahoma, I mean, if we're not in the theater world, I think it's deeply weird, actually. I saw it's deeply weird. And has some really problematic politics. But this recent staging undermined some of those political meetings purely through sound, purely through vocal quality. Didn't change the words, by and large didn't change the notes, but changed the meaning of the artwork through sound.
Through sound and sort of casting, embodiment, and vocal choices that the singers made and that the music director pulled out of the score. And the commentary is in the sound. Exactly. All right, so here's our quote. There's a new casualness to Curly's voice. Curly is the central cowboy figure. A forced ease, a celebration of prestige that comes by almost throwing status away and flouting norms of vocal behavior. No longer an open-throated operatic baritone, actor Damon Duano of the revival is a twangy, playful, high tenor, slight in body, virtuosic in range, even self-indulgent, somewhat mockingly adventurous in his vocalisms. The myth of the generic frontiersman at one with the wide open spaces of new land, all deep inner capacity, full of hope and open to the future, is now shattered. This Curly is not in harmony at all, really, as he flexes his extremely tenuous white masculine prestige where he can. This Curly is thin-skinned, cocky but not confident, on no side but his own, quick on the draw, and fully dangerous. The fact that he still possesses considerable charm, his songs rope us in with their unabashed display of vocal skill, is tempting and troubling in equal measure, particularly for members of his new audience who may longingly identify with his maverick spirit. Fish and Kluger, the director and musical director, reveal the holes in the myth of the self-contained, self-assured national identity. There is a psychic toll to be paid for this stolen land, a land now rendered unsafe and unstable. The American refusal to recognize its own mythology as such is implicated in a costly insistence that the nation's geographical borders, as well as the bodies of its people, could or should be impermeable, and an insistence that denies vulnerability, porousness, availability, and access to air itself in profound ways. We hear Duano's new cowboy in our right-wing political leaders, style and little substance, delusional about their self-made nature, quick to inflict violence on an unassimilable or invisible, unheard other, brittle and prone to self-pity as they paradoxically insist on the superiority of their kind. We ask, shouldn't such natural superiority be self-evident and not quite so in need of proclamations?
Thanks, all.
There we have it for now.
Yeah.
All right. I am delighted to open things up to questions. And thank you, Stephen, for keeping an eye on the questions coming in through Zoom. We have about 20 attendees on Zoom as well. I would love to open just with an initial question, just as folks are thinking. And so I'd really love to hear, I love the way, there's a very particular way. Wait, I'll come and sit down by you and hold the handheld because it's weird for you to have to turn and look at me. So I think that it's really lovely how, and I had the pleasure of getting to hear some of your thinking about this over the weekend. And there's a very particular way that both of your voices change a little bit when you're talking to one another as friends. It even shows up in calling each other a slightly different name. And I'd love to hear more about how that context of soundedness gave way to this book and how the particularities of your friendship pushed the kinds of things that you were able to articulate as an academic and an actor and vocal trainer.
Well, I'll say one thing that I'm aware of. I'm very much a fish out of water in this context. I mean, I'm not a lecturer. That's not the kind of classes I teach. I don't even think of myself as an academic. I'm a practitioner. However, I do think it's been really interesting to, first of all, not only open up shared language with each other, but in a way I was conscious of this just in this intro talk about shared gestural vocabulary, shared vocal vocabulary, shared action efforts. When I think about actors, the kinds of things that we do, that And also in the act of writing together, finding a common, I mean, the voice of us. Oh, well, I'll say one thing about writing that's kind of funny. So as I was learning to write this book and co-author this book, I rely, it's interesting that I brought up tone. I rely a lot on tone when I speak. My emphasis is really, it's something that I rely on a lot. And that would show up in my overuse of italics. Like I would,
It was a lot.
It
was a lot.
Sure they understood what I was saying. So in a way, we had to find a way to hear our voices together through the writing. And I also noticed as we were starting to talk about the book, that there were ways in which our voices relate.
Yeah. And I mean, we gave one talk and a philosopher said, I wrote this in the introduction, a philosopher said to us, what was co-writing like? It must be terrible. Philosophers are pretty worried about co-writing, and there's probably a lot there, but it wasn't. It was awesome. And one of the reasons it was awesome is that we could catch each other's mistakes. So I did point out italics a lot and said, how about just like, first I just got her down to like one a page, and then I'm like, okay, now we can go down a little further. And then she very gently said, yeah, you use the word ineluctably all the time. And I said, I do. And I look back and I'm like, I do. And again, she was like, maybe just once a page. No, you didn't say that. But like, I had to chapter. Yeah, there was a chapter. I had to take maybe 90% of them out. Yeah. So part of the co-writing, I know I found it incredibly comforting, like incredibly comforting that someone else was going to be looking at it, finding things I couldn't see. We both had experiences of writing ourselves into a corner and then saying, can you please write me out of this? Because I've written myself into a corner and I can't get out. And the other person would be like, yeah. And we would write each other out. I also think, but we were talking about, we might have a different perspective on this. Because I had to reread the book because, you know, Derrida and the text is independent and stuff like that. So like it's its own thing. So I have to remember what I did. And when I read it, the vast majority of it, I read as totally both of ours, except for the two co-authored chapters. Every once in a while, there's a chunk I'm like, oh yeah, that was definitely Chris. But I think because of our co-writing process and because it was grounded in conversation, we would meet, we would talk, and then a lot. And then we would say, okay, we would have little assignments. You write up this idea and I'll write up this idea. But what we were writing up were ideas that were developed together. You know, so in my mind, there's a co-authored voice in this book. Occasionally it splits into a distinct voice, but not very often. But were you saying that you had a different perspective than that? I don't know. We were talking
every once in a while, I thought I would see a passage now. I'm like, I don't remember if I wrote that.
Yeah, sometimes I don't remember.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't remember. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt that both of us starting from a kind of ground zero. The first thing we did in the summer was read the same books at the same time and share notes with each other. So it wasn't so much a sort of bringing hugely established expertises somehow. We were discovering at the same time.
Building it together.
Yeah. So I think in that way we definitely shaped.
Yeah.
In terms of being friends before, that does show up. I think that's totally right. It shows up in the book. It also, and I've said this to Chris a million times, it was really it was just a highlight of my life when I would get to go on these work weekends with Chris, and we have these incredibly intense days. Usually we would write from breakfast to lunch, and then we would talk for 2 to 3 hours, usually 3 to 4 hours, and then we'd write before dinner. And so it was this like intellectual, just immersion. And then at the end, we'd like to hang out with our family, who, you know, we love each other's families. And it was like this really intense set of pleasures. And that I'm sure that infuses the book, but I'm not sure I could get distance enough to say how.
No, I don't know. Yeah. Most of the time we've spent together now actually has been on this project.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay.
Let's see. Do we have any questions currently from the audience? I can come over to you with the mic if you would like the mic. Stephen also has been typing out the questions. So If anybody wants to be able to follow along and see the questions written out, you can click into the Zoom. But if you do, definitely mute the sound because we don't want it to do that weird echoey thing. But any questions? Okay.
Do I need a mic?
I'll bring it
Yes.
to you. And let's hope that when I walk around this, it doesn't do that. Oh, that's good. It didn't.
So thank you so much. This is just fascinating to me. And the question I have has just come from listening to your response to Lauren's question. So this idea that you guys, these ideas are kind of born out of a conversation that was a vocal conversation, that you would have a conversation with one another, and then that's kind of where the ideas came from. It just makes me question why we all think of any book as being single author. You know,
Well, right.
because, you know, like, so listening to that made me think, oh yeah, this is so great. Of course, you talked, you had a conversation, and then you're kind of the scribes who are going and kind of tracking that conversation. I just find it interesting, especially in philosophy, and I'm in political theory, so similar there as well. We value the single author, but it seems very disingenuous, right, to even claim to be a single author if these ideas are almost always collectively kind of generated. So that's, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but that's what it immediately made me think. And this is probably why we have these long acknowledgements
Yes,
at the
exactly.
beginning of our books.
Right.
We're always saying, you know, let me give credit to the numerous, you know, contexts in which I was in conversation with others that helped me sort of think through these ideas. So that's maybe just a comment. But it makes me think about the chapter on pedagogy and teaching in the classroom. And I'm wondering, I mean, I think we definitely, for many of us, especially in contexts like at Elon, where there's a strong emphasis on the teacher-scholar model, I think our own ideas are definitely forged in those classroom conversations with our students. But now what I'm wondering is, are there more, because I know you listed some things in that chapter on things we can do to change the context of the classroom. Are there things we can do, and do we want to radically rethink the classroom as a space of collectively forging knowledge with our students and understanding with our students? So I guess the first question is, do we want to reconceive it that way? Or is that pushing it too far? I don't know. And if we did, what would it look like? Are there kind of more ways to go about that, where I guess we have to not bring the idea that, you know, we have the knowledge that we're going to share, even if we adopt different ways of getting the students there. I mean, could we change it entirely where we are exploring together with our students?
Yeah, so that was my chapter writing about the philosophical, several philosophical sites, including the philosophical classroom and the philosophical conference. And part of what I'm arguing in that chapter for regard to the classrooms is that we have to pay attention to sound in classroom, which we, at least I have not like heard a lot about again, except exactly in like a metaphorical sense. So there's something underlying your question that says, like, if we understand the classroom as a collaborative space where we're forging knowledge, do we have to, I'm not sure you exactly said this, but do we almost have to leave, we certainly have to leave the notion that we're just there to convey knowledge or convey expertise. And I think we definitely do. But that doesn't mean that we have to do away with the notion of expertise. We don't have to collapse the difference between teacher and student. I don't think collapsing the difference between teacher and student completely is either feasible or pedagogically valuable, right? I think there's lots of different expertises in the room. And the question is how to focus on the interaction such that the interaction is marked by the particularity of the people in the room. So the lecturing voice is a voice that really says, it doesn't matter who's in front of me. I got my notes. I'm going to read them. And I mean, philosophical conferences, Stephen, back me up. They are the worst, y'all. I mean, because everyone reads word from word. You cannot hear the thinking in the voice. And I remember being in classes where classes were done like this, the graduate level. And I remember thinking, it would be so pleasant to fall asleep to this. Like it was the perfect lullaby. It was just like, it was delight. It would be, but you weren't supposed to. And one of the things I try to describe in that book is that in your voice, in its quality, is a sense of whether the people in front of you matter, whether they are contributing to the interaction. right? The lecturing voice says, I don't care, I'm gonna give it to you, then you're gonna leave, and another people are gonna come in. I don't care that it's different, it's, it's gonna be rote like that. Philosophers in conferences stick to the reading voice because we're so terrified that if we get one little thing wrong, and we're brutal in this field.
Yeah.
That's another thing that I had to learn. We learned a lot about each other's fields. I think I can say this. I wanted Chris to go after Linkletter. I was like, here we go. Like, we're gonna chop her up and you're gonna be the new Linkletter and it's gonna be great. And like, slowly Chris had to say, yeah, we're not gonna do that. Okay, because that's not what we do. Also certain words, like I wanted to talk about the voice as being flung. And I tried it once in front of theater people and their bodies just like, I said, so you fling your voice. And they went, oh, like that. Like, so like I had to get rid of that. But I think that we can create classrooms where the particularity of the students matter. And where we understand that students have expertise too. They have expertise in being students for one, but they have lots of expertise that the faculty member has to have. And the faculty member doesn't have to say, hey, I don't know anything. No, screw that. I've been reading this stuff for 25 years. I know some stuff, but what I don't know is how you and I are going to grapple with it. That I don't know. And that's why every class is going to be different. But I think there's lots we could do. I was mostly talking about the classroom as a sonorous space. And I think we have underestimated the role of sound in pedagogical spaces.
Here's a question from Andrew Alden. I'd like to ask more about intervocality as a concept. Is it always built through mutually present human-human relations? Can it be built around the relation between, say, humans and animals, humans and musical instruments, humans and books, humans and the dead?
Oh, you're there for a while. You're gonna get this one.
Sure. Yes. I think it can and should be all of those things. It's just a metaphor that comes to mind, or yeah, the metaphor comes to mind. For actors, even if there isn't someone on stage with us, if we're doing, we call it like a soliloquy, there's always an imagined, there's in the world of the imaginary that marks my experience, imagined other or a private audience. I think relationship can be endowed in animate or inanimate ways, and of course it's going to have an impact on my need to speak or my desire to sound or to even when we're alone talking to ourselves, right? I clearly, whether or not I'm conscious of it, I'm trying things out with a perceived audience. And if that is God, if that is my cat, if that is my dead grandmother, whoever it is, that can be a very powerful shaping force. And I don't see how that's in a way any less real than the person, the imaginary of the person in front of me in the room. Of course, they're not imaginary, but my image of them is what I take in on a psychophysical level. I think that makes a lot of sense. Why not?
Yeah, I'm interested in the last, the intervocality with the dead. I think a lot of people who mourn loved ones find themselves speaking to them.
I think that's right.
And part of what's going on, I wouldn't want to reduce it to this, is in speaking to my loved one who is no longer in the same life as I am, I bring back to being the being I was in relation to them. Right? I can once again be the person that was defined is a little too strong, was marked by them, that I can be the person that they evoked.
Still relating.
And part of mourning is that recognition when the other person leaves, if we love that person, we're left with some form of who the hell am I without them? Because who I was, something fundamental about me was only evoked in this relationship, and I'm at loose ends ontologically. I don't know who I am. And most of the time, of course, our culture is terrible at mourning. Most of the time, one of the things that mourning involves is learning to become a person who is no longer in that kind of contact with that person. We got to become someone else in some level. And of course, I don't know. I think I think we sometimes, I mean, I do. I'm very angry that people I love are mortal. I think they've got a hell of a nerve. Like, really, who do they think they are that they might leave at some point? I think it's just rude. And that resentment that might come from the reconstruction that has to take place. You know, when become a person we don't want to become, but we have to.
I can see that we have several questions coming in the chat, several good questions. I want to take a room temperature and see if anybody is jumping to ask one in here. Okay. One of our researchers.
So I'm wondering, in the realm of music, how would the politics of invoicing apply to technologically enhanced or altered voices?
Yeah. Yeah.
I need a second to breathe.
Sure. Sure. So we don't write much about this in the book. And some other philosophers have. Don Ivey has a lot in his book about the technology. There's lots of books in sound studies about the creation of the phonograph. There was one book, I'm actually blanking on which one it was. It had a page in it at the very beginning that I had to look at over and over because I thought this can't be right. But it was an early telephone, I think, that started with an actual human ear attached to the wire. And I kept looking at it going, is that what I think it is? Early attempts at the telephone were actually attempts to turn sound into written language, because everyone's like, why would you want to hear sound? Sound is ephemeral. Sound doesn't last. Turn it into text, and now you've got something worth keeping. And then some weird things happened that I don't remember. Anyway, so I think there's a lot to say about technology. We have one part. Do you want to talk about the one part when we talk about technology after COVID with the performances over Zoom?
Oh, no, you can do that. I'll talk about
Okay.
something else.
So we have one part of the book where we talk, this is in the conclusion where we talk about vocal politics in the COVID era. And we talk about early on in the pandemic, there were some very meaningful Zoom events, like the Hamilton cast came together and performed for like a fan, or they performed, I think, on John Krasinski's Feel Good show, right? And there was something incredibly moving about experiencing people making sound together, because we couldn't go and do it live, although you did have the Italians singing on the balconies and you had some experiences like that. But we did talk about how, if you understand the technology of those events, they were not simultaneous. Zoom is not good at simultaneous sound making. You have to all make it individually, and then a ton of work needs to be put in to create the sort of image, not the image, that's a terrible word, but the illusion of co-voicing. And we did find it really interesting of how much we were craving co-voicing and how much we weren't noticing that the technology was kind of lying to us. That's not really answering your question, but there's, we don't write a ton about technology, but we think there's a lot to say about it.
Yeah. I'll add just a couple thoughts, which is, you know, particularly in theater, I think we think of technology as sort of a unit, like a monolith, like technology. But I think it's also worth thinking about a technology that shows up in any deliberate acoustic framing. So going back to like classical Greek theater, there is technology in the amphitheater. It's just not electronic technologies. There's technology about how voices carry and why. So there are values there. The voices that are literally designed through that to carry up to the audience, but to, you know, the gods. I think that's a particular political idea. But I'm also thinking about, and some of our research took us into, it just didn't end up in the book, about like early use of radio and microphones and how they were actually like created in such a way to capture the tones that are most often found in masculine voices, and how early feminine radio announcers were described as being rather tinny and high, because they're like, their fundamental pitch lay a bit outside of what was actually going to be received in the mic, so things like that, I think, are really interesting. What sounds get amplified quite literally in terms of sort of the unquestioned structures around, how that works. Actually, we have a really interesting response. To
Yeah,
our
we're
book.
going to have to write about this.
Yeah, we are going to have to write about this,
Yeah.
about the difference between, how when voices are amplified by a microphone versus a megaphone, in terms of directionality, in terms of the political implications. So when do people have the mic? What is the power that comes with being handed a mic or dropping a mic, or having a megaphone, like when you are actually working with voicing with a crowd? Like, those are two very different technologies that carry very different meanings and use acoustics in very different ways. So that would be a couple of examples that we're going to be writing about.
Also about refusing the mic. You want to talk about refusing the mic?
What are you talking about?
Like when you're in an event and someone says, "Do you need a mic?" and the person says,
Oh, yes. So people in
"That's a great example."
yeah, so people who this is a really interesting access question about folks who I was in a meeting recently where someone was had a question to sort of offer the group, and it was a group of probably about 60 people. And it was an actor, professor, who was like, "No, I don't need a mic. I don't need a mic." And it was a sort of point of pride. But in fact, I'm not sure that everyone in the room could hear them. So even today, like, we probably both could be heard, but it's not actually opening doors for access to understanding. And that's something we have to contend with in theater a lot, which is sort of what is the value of having the unmediated sound versus a sound that provides access, and the ethical questions around that versus and the electronic versus sort of human embodiment of that are really, really relevant and important questions right now. Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Shiloh Whitney asks, "I'm interested in the relationship of voice in the sonorous respiratory sense you distinguish from speech to breath and affect. For example, in the sigh of relief. What's underneath my question is, I think perhaps some of your account of vocal injustice cashes out to be variations on epistemic injustice, but I'm wondering if they should be considered differently as affective injustices. Affective injustices involve very different sorts of injurious effects, not injuries to credibility, for instance, but to affective influence, or even to vitality, exhaustion, burnout, for example."
Yeah, I think it's one of those questions that ended up with a really interesting answer to their own question. So I think there are important relationships between vocal injustice and epistemic injustice, right? And especially with some of the work on epistemic injustice. Some work on epistemic injustice would be way too sort of knowledge-based, conceptual, and leaves the body behind. But some some work on epistemic injustice doesn't do that at all and keeps the body very much in the mix. So I think there are relations, but I don't think that our notion of vocal injustice and the relationship between voice, identity, breath can be reduced in the end or totally captured by the notion of epistemic injustice. We do argue in several places, particularly in our chapter on sex, childbirth, and maternity. We do argue for the importance of understanding voice as being able to do stuff. So we didn't really talk about this in this text, but the central part of our thinking is that the voice is not just a channel by which the interior becomes exterior. So it's not just a medium, right? It can get stuff done. It can change situations, it can change sensations, it can change experiences, and certainly can change subjects. And so in that sense, when vocal injustice renders certain kinds of vocalizations unwelcome, impossible, or problematic, childbirth is a great example, right? That can keep certain things from being done that would forward the flourishing of at least a couple people involved in the process. So I guess that might be why I'm resisting a little bit epistemic injustice, maybe a tad unfairly, but I want to hold on to the notion that voice as action achieves things by virtue of its soundedness.
Yeah, Yeah, I think I would just add to that just in terms of like the context in which it was introducing the idea of a sigh of relief and sort of what the productive nature of that, because it really isn't just the removal of something, or I hope this is speaking to the questions asking, the removal of like a block or, but I think that the idea that the voice then is, there's the possibility of having, what we're calling more and more, actually, we're borrowing from philosophy, the idea of an affective response in a way, the affective speech versus effective speech. So that speech, in terms of like understanding it, this is another place where there could be all kinds of injustices in the training room or rehearsal room for theaters when someone is told that their speech isn't clear, but really it's just an accent, when their speech is like not going to reach a white middle class audience. But we're thinking a lot more about like how a lot of vocal information and body information relationship can be created and using the tools that we have, but that allows us to render relationships possible, whether or not there's a kind of sense of like clarity. I'm not sure I'm exactly speaking to this.
Well, I think what we're trying to get at is that our notion of vocal injustice and creating more vocally generous aspects does not reduce the voice to a channel of affect.
Or just a conduit by which,
it's something by which affect can be brought into being, can be generated.
I'm sure. Okay, coming over there.
This is bouncing directly off of Morgan's question, answer to which I'm excited to talk about with her. So y'all, there is no quote natural voice, right? But can there be kind of a like desired natural voice in the sense that I'm thinking about the like practice of trans people in music intentionally and drastically altering their voice electronically to either like kind of dismantle the expectation that their voice should sound a certain way, or even like induce gender euphoria by approaching that more like authentic or desired voice. I'm also thinking about like the concept of speaking to one's inner child, like invoking two different people to have a conversation about a relationship to oneself or a possibility of like an alternate reality in which those two different people could have joined as one. Right?
I'll just say I think this is what you're talking about. The difference between natural and or even introducing the word authentic and what that has to do with self-reception. So how do I receive myself? Do I receive myself with I don't think there's any problem in terms of what we're talking about of a feeling of naturalness, or feeling of, I don't think it's an unjust idea that there may feel like I have developed my voice in such a way or received vocal support in such a way that allows me to feel this sort of like integrated continuity of self. What we're saying is that the picture of natural living underneath without the marks of influence of any kind, social, cultural, political, is a false picture. And but I think the idea of natural can be evoked with wonderfully just, effects in a certain way. What were you going to say about that?
Yeah. I think we're thinking with Butler here, right? Judith Butler really argues that feeling of naturalness is a fabrication. It's a construction. It's an achievement.
An ongoing one.
Yeah, an ongoing one. And I think, Billy, what you were talking about in terms of the, using technology to change the voice in some ways to jam up the machinery, right? That makes total sense too, especially if you start from the process that there's no such thing as the unmediated voice, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like over here, you're getting someone's actual voice. And over here, this person is like mangling and deconstructing. No. Just different approaches, right? Different steps taken, but no one has a single authentic voice, right? So using various techniques to question our listening practices, that's what I see in those, right? To make us aware of our listening practices, to make us aware of how listening practice impose gender expectations, say, and like, you know, muck with that. That is absolutely part of vocal justice, because it makes obvious what our listening is doing and the co-constitutive nature of listening to both the quality of the sound and to its social and political meanings. So we write about various kinds of we write a little bit about some surgeries, we write a little bit about some therapies that vocal coaches use and practices that use with trans folks. And what we end up saying is that, you know, those can be incredible acts. In fact, they seem to us like they're getting better and more just all the time, as they leave behind essentialist notions of gendered voice, right? So what Kate Bornstein had to go through in the 80s, where someone said, I'm going to teach you to talk like a woman. And like, that person was not teaching Kate Bornstein to talk like me, right? Right. So then that was really oppressive. But this notion that how you live your voice matters to your sense of self, and you are not completely responsible for how that voice is going to be received. You are not in control. And the point of coaching and therapy is not for you to get it right so that a transphobic world, right, will hear you in a way that's legible to them. That would be unjust. And luckily we see, you know, from what we read, the practice is going in that direction.
This is a question from Kimberly White. Thank you for this discussion. It's bringing up a lot of questions. Christine, as a Linkletter teacher, I'm curious about how you teach this work, or do you? How do you approach a sigh of relief? How do you approach jaw and tongue tension? How do you prepare an actor to be able to perform a vocally challenging part in an 8-week run? Thanks, Kimberly.
Thank you, Kimberly. This is a very specific question around where there's a shared vocabulary here, as we're both Linkletter teachers. I would say my first response is for me, the thing I'm working with in the classroom most now is starting with a kind of awareness of what we're carrying in the room in terms of like our breath as it is now, our jaws as they are now, the tensions we carry with us as they are now. And I'm really trying to inhibit going too quickly to any kind of vocabulary that then takes us to, and now let's fix it. And I know that's not in our shared vocabulary. However, it can be often latent in the room, which is like, and now let's let it go. And now let's assume we're safe, feel the safety of the floor, assume we're, you know, so I think actually spending more time to give bodies in the space more opportunity to sense that their daily experiences both matter and have an opportunity to register what those experiences are, seems to be opening up a lot of headway in terms of the tone in the room, which is, of course, you know, actors, in order to sustain, you know, a run for 8 weeks, absolutely have to have a kind of, you know, freedom and energy that gets moved through the body, and there are ways in which, you know, we have to work with when actors are feeling stuck energetically, or when their voices are stuck in their throats. But I think the preparatory work is where I'm putting most of my attention now, which is not assuming that we can so quickly go to and let things go, because the ways in which marginalized bodies moving into the room in various ways is takes more time to actually acknowledge before we can move on with the work of sort of the undoing. So that's like a very small response. I think also with diversely gendered people in the room, one of the things that I think we're all thinking about in our community is challenging kind of notions about like what we think that freedom looks and sounds like, because the sense of there may be more freedom to be found in a smaller pitch range. There may be more freedom to be found, you know, within certain qualities than we think, that might have more benefits to that actor in terms of their own level of like relaxation than we might find if there were sort of pre-established pitches, which is something we've been working with for some time. So those are just a couple of things that I've been thinking about.
How many do we have in the? Oh, you're good. Okay.
So my voice at home, I'm someone who has a very Southern accent with my family. It comes out a lot. But when I'm in public, I almost tone it down because from a very young age, I had the assumption that because of my heavy accent, I was ignorant. And I'm almost wondering, is there a next step to like facing and understanding this? Because I understand that my voice was shaped by very negative social aspects, but it's still my voice and something that is very personal to me. It doesn't make it inherently wrong because of what shaped it.
Sure. I mean, there's so many things at work there. It's interesting as someone who teaches accents and dialects, how often I've been asked to like help people reduce their accent so they can sidestep criticism, and how I tend to be not inclined to want to do that. And it's such an interesting dynamic relationship that we have with like sort of cultural stereotypes about various, I mean, we haven't even said the phrase code switching yet in this talk, and this is a way in which I can imagine in certain contexts wanting to like, and I have lots of students who, certainly tone down their regional accent in certain settings, and then it comes out, or languages or accents that have to do with not all accents and dialects are regional. Some of them are socioeconomic, some of them are cultural. So it's not like justice would what would that look like? Illuminating all of the listening ears so they know that they're listening to you with bias. That we have this like tradition of those cultural stereotypes about like certain kinds of Southern accents and certain embodiments. And then, if someone came to me saying, look, I want to be able to reduce my accent at will, I would question it and really want to get underneath why. And also know that there are prestige accents, there are prestige dialects that give people more platforms, and whether or not that is a good, it is not a good thing, but it might help sometimes with folks feeling like they have more social mobility. So it's just a very complex question, and I would always like really have I'd be inclined to have a really in-depth conversation with someone about it as they were looking to make any shifts. I'm not sure really answered what you were talking about.
Yeah, it's an important question because we try to distinguish in the book between the claim that it is not problematic that we all have different voices in different contexts. That is not a problem, right? We think that's a characteristic of the voice and of intervocality, right? What's a problem is when, and this is the case with a lot of racialized code switching, right, is when persons need to take on certain vocal gestures and characteristics in order to remain legible. And one thing our theory, I think, brings out is that you're not in control of the social context that associates all that, and there is a cost to pay, there's a price to pay for that particular kind of code switching. It is not all like, well, now I get some social goods because I've left this accent behind and people won't think these things of me. Yeah, that might be a benefit, but because in our approach, voices matter to who we are, and they speak where we came from. And if I have to deny that, if I have to hide it, right, then I am paying a high price for that legibility. And no matter how you choose to navigate that, the ethical spotlight needs to be put on the unjust meanings that are attached to the dialect. And then, like, how you deal with it, in my mind, like I would support you in however you want to deal with it. But let's remember, you're not where the ethical spotlight should be. That's not where the ethics is happening. The ethics is happening in unjust associations of vocal sounds with certain strings.
Now, I want to honor that we are at time, though I'm interested in the other questions. I want to honor that because I know that some other folks may have meetings that they need to go to, though I'm very curious to hear your question. And so I'm going to stop the recording. Bye.